There are criminal cases that remain unsolved because the evidence was never there. The killer was careful, the scene was clean, the witnesses saw nothing, and the passage of time erased whatever traces remained. These cases are genuinely tragic in the specific way that irresolvable mysteries are tragic, leaving families and investigators and communities without the closure that answers provide. The murder of JonBenét Ramsay is not one of those cases. The murder of JonBenét Ramsay is something considerably more disturbing than an unsolvable mystery. It is a case in which the evidence existed, in which the technology to process that evidence and potentially identify a killer has existed for years, and in which a series of institutional decisions, made by identifiable people in identifiable positions of authority, ensured that the evidence was never fully used. What has kept this case open for nearly 3 decades is not the absence of answers. It is the presence of choices that were made by the people whose job it was to find those answers, choices that have never been adequately explained or accounted for. Understanding why that matters requires understanding who JonBenét Ramsay was before she became a photograph on a magazine cover. She was 6 years old. She was a kindergartner with blonde hair and the kind of face that photographs well, a fact that her parents had discovered through child beauty pageants, a world that would come to define the public's perception of her after her death in ways that served no one well and reduced a living child to a set of images that felt more like a performance than a person. But behind the pageant photographs, she was exactly what a 6-year-old is supposed to be. She rode her bike. She loved Christmas. She had a 9-year-old brother named Burke and parents who had built, by every outward measure, the kind of life that the American dream was supposed to produce. John Ramsey had run a computer distribution company called Access Graphics to $1 billion in annual revenue. He was a former Navy officer, a corporate executive, a man whose professional biography belonged on a business page rather than a crime report. His wife Patsy had been Miss West Virginia in 1977, had survived a diagnosis of ovarian cancer in the years before JonBenét's death with the intensity that near-death experiences produce in people who are paying attention to how fragile time is, and had poured that intensity into her family and her home with the energy of someone who understood that ordinary days do not last forever. Their house matched the family in its scale and ambition. A 15-room Tudor in Boulder, Colorado, in a neighborhood called Chautauqua, tucked against the foothills of the Rockies in the kind of community where serious violent crime was genuinely unusual enough that people left their doors unlocked without particular anxiety. Boulder in the mid-1990s was a university town of professors and outdoor enthusiasts and the kind of quiet wealth that does not need to announce itself. The police department was structured accordingly, built for property crime and the occasional assault, not for what was about to land on them. The last ordinary day of the Ramsay family's life was Christmas, 1996. They spent the evening at the home of friends, the kind of casual holiday gathering where children run between rooms and adults talk in the kitchen and everyone has somewhere to be tomorrow. The Ramsays had early flights to catch. They were heading to their vacation home in Michigan, and suitcases were already half-packed. They came home around 9 that night, and by the account given to investigators, JonBenét fell asleep in the car on the way back and was carried inside and put to bed without waking fully. Burke went to bed. The lights went out through the 15 rooms one by one, and sometime in the hours that followed, in a window the medical examiner would later place between approximately 10 that night and just before 6 the next morning, a 6-year-old girl was killed inside that house. The silence that surrounded that killing is the first thing that makes this case so strange and so persistently disturbing. There was no forced entry that investigators could establish conclusively. No neighbor heard anything that night. No scream, no breaking glass, no car idling at an unusual hour. No one in the house reported hearing a struggle or footsteps or any sound that registered as wrong in the night. In a 15-room house occupied by 4 people on a still winter night in one of the safest kinds of neighborhoods, a child was murdered, and by every account the house remained silent. Whatever happened to JonBenét Ramsay happened without producing a sound loud enough to wake the people sleeping nearby. The morning of December 26th began with Patsy Ramsay coming downstairs early, dressed and moving toward the kitchen, finding on the stairs 3 pages of handwritten text laid across the treads and reading enough to understand what she was looking at before she screamed for her husband. What she had found was a ransom note, though calling it that barely captures what it actually was. It ran approximately 370 words across 2.5 pages of a legal pad. It opened by addressing John Ramsey directly, announced that JonBenet was in the custody of a group it described as a small foreign faction, and laid out specific instructions. He was to assemble a specific sum of money, await a phone call between 8 and 10 the following morning, and refrain from contacting police or his daughter would be killed. It closed with a signature that has never been decoded, the word victory followed by the letters SBTC. Almost nothing about that note was consistent with what actual ransom notes look like. Investigators who have worked kidnapping cases will tell you that genuine ransom demands are short and functional. They are written before the crime, prepared in advance, designed for quick deployment. They do not indulge. They do not perform. This note did both. Its language had the quality of dialogue from a thriller film, literate and theatrical in ways that suggested someone who was enjoying the act of composition rather than executing a criminal plan under time pressure. And the physical evidence of the note's creation was even more alarming than its content. The legal pad on which the note was written was traced to a pad that belonged to the Ramsey household. The pen used to write it was found inside the house. Whoever had written that note had not brought their materials. They had sat down somewhere in those 15 rooms in the dark hours of a winter night and composed nearly 400 words on the family's own stationery with the family's own pen, taking their time while a child lay dead or dying in the basement below. The estimate of how long it would take to write a document of that length in that careful hand runs from 20 minutes to close to an hour. An intruder does not break into an occupied home, commit a murder, and then remain on the premises for the better part of an hour to handwrite a 3-page essay. The behavior is so foreign to everything known about how violent crimes unfold that it strains credulity in any direction you point it. The ransom figure the note demanded was $118,000. Not a round number designed to suggest maximum extraction from a wealthy target. Not $1 million. Not $500,000. $118,000. A sum so specific and so oddly modest for a man running a billion-dollar company that investigators looked at it carefully. What they found was that the figure matched almost exactly a Christmas bonus John Ramsey had recently received. Not a publicly known number. Not the kind of figure that would appear in a news article about Access Graphics or Lockheed Martin. A private household detail, the kind of information that circulates in conversations about money within a family, the kind of number you might know if you were inside that household's life. A foreign faction planning an abduction against a corporate executive for ransom purposes does not ask for the exact amount of the man's most recent bonus. Whoever wrote that note knew that number, which meant they knew the family in a way that pointed the investigation uncomfortably inward from its very first moment. Patsy Ramsey did not follow the note's instructions. At 5:52 that morning she called 911, her voice breaking as she told the dispatcher that her daughter had been taken and that police needed to come immediately. What happened after that call became one of the most analyzed and most criticized sequences of decisions in the history of American criminal investigation. Not because the people involved were malicious, but because they were doing human, reasonable, understandable things in a situation that demanded forensic precision that nobody present understood was necessary. The first officers arrived believing they were responding to a kidnapping, a situation in which the victim was presumed alive somewhere else. The house was treated accordingly, not as a crime scene requiring preservation but as a command center for managing a hostage situation. The front door stayed open. Friends were called and arrived through that open door. A minister came. Victim advocates were admitted. Someone made coffee. Someone cleaned the kitchen. People moved through the rooms, sat on furniture, used bathrooms, touched surfaces, and laid down fibers and footprints that would spend the next 3 decades confounding forensic analysis. Every person who walked through that door was doing exactly what decent human beings do when someone they love is in crisis, and every person who walked through that door was inadvertently destroying the evidentiary record of what had happened the night before. The single detective initially assigned to manage the scene was a woman named Linda Arndt, and she has said publicly that she was one person trying to watch a family, coordinate a search, manage the contamination problem, and hold together a situation that was slipping beyond any individual's capacity to control. She was waiting, along with everyone else in the house, for the phone call the ransom note had promised between 8 and 10 in the morning. 8 came. 9. 10. The phone did not ring. A ransom demand had been delivered, and the kidnappers never called to collect. As the window closed in silence, the story the note had constructed began to dissolve. In that dissolving atmosphere, Arndt made the decision that would be second-guessed for decades. She asked John Ramsey and a family friend to walk through the house and look for anything unusual. Without a trained investigator accompanying him, without anyone watching what he touched or how he moved through the rooms, John Ramsey went to the basement. In a small windowless room behind a door, a wine cellar tucked into the maze of the basement's lower level, he found his daughter. She lay on the concrete floor wrapped in a white blanket, her wrists bound and raised above her head. He did what any father would do. He gathered her up in his arms and carried her upstairs, calling out that he had found her, tearing away the tape at her mouth, pulling at the bindings. By the time trained personnel could examine the body in the position and condition in which it was left, that position and condition no longer existed. The most important piece of evidence in the entire case had been irrevocably altered before the investigation properly began. What the subsequent autopsy revealed was a death of extraordinary violence carried out with a deliberateness that has made arguments about accidental causation difficult to sustain. JonBenet had suffered a skull fracture running approximately 8.5 inches across her head, caused by a single blow of sufficient force that a forensic pathologist testified it would have rendered her instantly and completely unconscious. Around her neck was a ligature made from a cord, wound tight around the broken handle of a paintbrush, knotted into a garrote that could be tightened by twisting the handle. That paintbrush, investigators determined, came from an art supply tote belonging to Patsy Ramsey that was kept in the basement. 2 causes of death, both delivered with deliberate force. The question of which came first, the blow to the skull or the strangulation, became the axis around which competing theories of the crime rotated for years. If the blow came first and was not intended to kill, if it was delivered in rage or panic and caused catastrophic unintended injury, then the strangulation afterward reads as a desperate attempt to stage the death as something other than what it was, to transform an accident into the appearance of an abduction. If the strangulation was the primary act, performed with the purpose of killing, then you are looking at a predator who came to that house for exactly this purpose and proceeded with methodical, deliberate cruelty. Experts argued both positions for decades and never reached consensus, and you cannot build a prosecution on a crime whose basic character remains contested. For a long time the internal evidence of the case pointed relentlessly toward the household. When a child dies inside a locked home with no definitive evidence of outside entry, statistical probability and investigative logic both start with the people inside. The note written on the family's own materials. The paintbrush from the family's own belongings. The ransom figure matching a private financial detail. One lead detective, Steve Thomas, became sufficiently convinced that he resigned from the Boulder Police Department and wrote a book arguing that Patsy Ramsey was responsible. He built his theory carefully and argued it with conviction. And then the laboratory returned a finding that dismantled the logic he had constructed. In JonBenet's underwear, mixed with biological material of her own, there was DNA from an unknown male. It was not John Ramsey. It was not Patsy Ramsey. It was not Burke Ramsey. It did not match anyone in the family's social circle who was tested. Later analysis using more sensitive techniques found the same male profile as touch DNA on the waistband of her long underwear on both sides, as though hands had gripped the garment. One genetic profile, multiple locations, belonging to someone who could not be identified. For the investigators who believed an intruder had entered that house, this was the killer's signature, sitting in the national DNA database for a quarter century, waiting for someone to do something with it. The counterargument has always been contamination. The garment had been manufactured and handled by unknown individuals before it was purchased. A DNA profile from a factory worker who touched the material during production would explain a foreign profile without invoking any intruder. This disagreement, genuine and unresolvable without additional evidence, has defined the case for 28 years. Two interpretations of the same physical evidence, both defensible, neither conclusive, and no mechanism available to determine which is correct until the profile is matched to a person. That matching has always been possible in principle and has never been accomplished in practice. The technology that could accomplish it has existed in various forms since the early 2000s and in its most powerful current form since approximately 2018, when forensic genetic genealogy was used to identify the Golden State Killer by uploading his crime scene DNA profile to public ancestry databases and constructing a family tree back to a suspect. Since that success, the same technique has been applied to more than 600 cold cases across the United States and has produced identifications in cases that had been sitting unresolved for decades. The JonBenét Ramsay DNA profile has been in federal databases for 25 years. It has never been uploaded to the genealogy platforms where those 600 other cases were broken. The explanations offered for this absence have been consistent and real. Questions of jurisdiction between local and federal authorities. Concerns about sample degradation and chain of custody. The administrative complexity of coordinating between the Boulder Police Department and the FBI. These are genuine institutional realities and not fabrications. What they are not is a sufficient explanation for why a technology that identified a serial killer from decades-old evidence could not be applied to one of the most prominent unsolved child murders in American history. Every other case that genealogy technology broke also had chain of custody considerations, degraded samples, and jurisdictional complexity. Those cases got resolved anyway. There is also the matter of what happened in 1999. A grand jury was impaneled, heard evidence in secret for more than a year, and reached conclusions that the district attorney at the time announced were insufficient to support charges against anyone. That announcement was technically accurate in what it said and profoundly misleading in what it omitted. In 2013, following a journalist's legal battle to unseal the grand jury documents, the public learned that the jurors had in fact voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for the murder of their daughter but for child abuse resulting in death and for acting as accessories to a crime, charges that imply the jurors believed the parents had knowledge of who killed their daughter and took steps to shield that person. The district attorney had declined to sign the indictment. He never fully explained why. For 14 years, the public believed that the grand jury had found the evidence insufficient. The truth was that the grand jury had found the evidence sufficient and a single official had chosen not to proceed. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in June 2006 at 49 years old, having spent the decade between her daughter's death and her own living under a cloud of public suspicion that never fully lifted despite the DNA findings that should have moved the inquiry away from her. She died without resolution. The man who had worn the Santa Claus suit at a party the Ramsey family attended in the days before Christmas 1996 died in 2002, having spent his final years as a subject of public speculation despite DNA testing that cleared him. A number of people adjacent to this case spent portions of their lives under shadows that the investigative process generated and never removed. Following a documentary in 2024 that reopened public attention to the case, Boulder Police announced new advanced DNA analysis work being conducted in partnership with the FBI. The announcement was more detailed than previous statements about forensic work, suggesting that the genealogy approach was finally being brought to bear. Whether that work will produce an identification, whether the sample quality is sufficient to generate usable genealogy results, whether the profile belongs to the person who killed JonBenet or to a factory worker who touched her garment, none of these questions have been answered publicly. What has been answered, definitively and without remaining ambiguity, is the question of whether this case was kept open by the absence of tools. It was not. The tools existed. The database existed. The technology existed, improved, was applied successfully to hundreds of comparable cases, and was not applied here, for reasons that have been offered in various forms across the years but that add up to something less than adequate when placed against the backdrop of what the technology accomplished everywhere else it was used. A 6-year-old girl was killed inside her home in December of 1996. Her killer left a genetic signature on her clothing. That signature has been in federal databases for a quarter century. The explanation of why it has not yet been matched to a person is not a scientific explanation. It is an institutional one, and it is the most disturbing thing about a case that has never been short of disturbing things. The horror at the center of the JonBenét Ramsey case is not the mystery. Mysteries are comprehensible as human tragedies. The horror is the possibility that this was never quite as much of a mystery as it appeared, that the evidence was available and the tools were available and the decisions made around both were shaped by forces other than the simple desire to find out what happened to a 6-year-old girl in Boulder, Colorado, in the early hours of the day after Christmas. Whether the new DNA work produces an answer will determine whether this becomes the story of a case that took too long and cost too much but ultimately got there, or whether it becomes the story of a case in which the machinery of justice made choices that nobody has yet been required to fully explain. JonBenét Ramsey would be 35 years old. She would have a whole life behind her that the world knows nothing about, because that life was never permitted to happen. What is owed to her at this point is not continued debate about theories that have been debated for 3 decades. What is owed is the use of every available tool to answer the question of who killed her, and a full and honest accounting of why it took this long to use them.